if your business should fail, and if there is a personal guarantee, it falls onto you
Mm-hmm.
to sponsor those debts. I remember when I was just out of high school, I was working at a law firm in New York City. I was working in the law room, in the mail room, file room before I actually went to college. And I remember there was an IBM technician who came in to repair our photocopier. And when he came in to repair our photocopier, he told me that he had pursued an entrepreneurial endeavor. I believe he had tried to start up a restaurant. And he had told me, of course, at this point in time, I had no real understanding of business, but he confirmed to me that he had a restaurant business. He was a Jamaican gentleman, and he
Mm-hmm.
out an enormous amount of debt so that he can start up his dream, which was a restaurant. Lo and behold, the restaurant business didn't work out as it should. And he was telling me about his experience with now having to file bankruptcy because
Wow.
he had personal guarantees against his name for the business. So, it's been sitting with me ever since that time that you want to make sure that you are doing what you can to avoid being in a situation where you are providing personal guarantees. And I
Definitely.
guess that's been our message ever since then, right? All right, so let's get started because we know that we don't want to hold people too long, but personal guarantees destroy the separation that you have between you and your business. I'm going to say this, but a personal guarantee, or better known as PG, defeats the purpose of having an LLC or corporation, right? Because now you are basically saying that you're co-signing for the business, right? So let's just really make sure, like from a coaching standpoint, we have to get clear on what is the definition, right? A PG, or personal guarantee, is when you are personally signing for liability for any debt, right? If the business should default, the lender can go after your personal credit. The lender can freeze your personal bank accounts, and the lender can pursue legal judgments against you, the individual, right? At this stage, because you signed a PG, your EIN basically becomes irrelevant because your social security number is still backing the deal, right? So if your business should fail and you signed a PG, your personal life becomes the collateral. And I would even go so far as to say, not just your personal life, but your family's personal life becomes the collateral, because whatever happens to you is going to have an impact on your family, right? So, why did you even go out and create an LLC?
Yeah.
Right? You went and created an LLC so that you could have risk management, right? As an entrepreneur, you don't want to be doing business in your name. You also created the entity for asset protection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And finally, the reason why you created that LLC was so that you can probably establish your legacy and through that build long term wealth, because now the entity can transfer between family members because there's an operating agreement which explains what happens should one die, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when you are Signing that PG, you are saying, no, me personally, I stand behind this business and its liabilities. Should anything go wrong, come to me. And we know from personal experience that that has been the case before.
Yeah.
Anything to add on to that, Eunice?
No, I think you've mentioned everything. There is that danger in personally signing. The question for you then is there ever any time that you have to, or you don't have any other choice but to personally guarantee a loan or funds for your business?
Well, I would say from a startup capacity, there is an opportunity where you can personally guarantee something. But
Mhm.
what you want to do is that needs to be limited to the first, 6 to 12, 18 months of the business being in business. The very first thing that you should be doing is building out trade lines and trade experiences under the business such that now you can remove that debt where you have a personal guarantee and now only be relying on debt that is tied to the business's EIN number. So that's a great question. I would say, and my recommendation is you would only do that when your business doesn't have a credit history, and that's what you're doing in order to get it started.
Okay. That makes sense because I think a lot of times, people may be wondering, but how do I even establish business credit? How do I begin to ensure that I don't use my personal guarantee? So, like you said, in the beginning, you might be needed to do that. And I think one of
Mhm.
the things is in the beginning as well, when you are doing that, you have to be very careful also in terms of the amounts that you're personally guaranteeing for, right? It
Mm.
wouldn't make sense to overwhelm yourselves to the extent that if, and we're not saying, your business is going to go close down, but in the event that if something does happen and you are forced to close down, that you have not put all your assets in jeopardy, right? So if the less the amount that you have to personally guarantee as you're building that credit, the better, because once then you are in a good spot where now you have established that business credit, you know that you no longer have to now personally guarantee. Then you can allow those requests to maybe now go a little bit higher, also in line with what the business can actually afford to pay back.
And as we transition to the next topic, I believe that it's short-term thinking when you do sign a PG, right? Because
Mhm.
when you sign with a PG, you become a cap on the growth of your business. You see what I'm saying?
Mhm.
So personal guarantees, although that might be a short-term fix so that you can get access to capital, you are going to be capped because when they are looking to have you be a signer on the loan or the credit obligation, they're going to look at your personal FICO score. So whatever is there on your personal side is going to be impacted there on the business side. So your personal FICO score, and you wouldn't believe how many conversations I have had with individuals who told me that they wanted to start a business, but they wanted to do it using business credit because their personal credit was in the basement. I told
Mhm.
them it's going to be very difficult, but you can do it, but you're going to have to go through the long process of starting at tier one, working your way up from tier one to tier two, tier three to tier four, etc. And that's where the honeypot is. So when you are basically providing a personal guarantee, you are capping your growth because it's all going to be tied to your personal finance score. It's going to be tied to your personal debt to income ratio. And it's also going to be tied to your personal credit utilization, right? And in my famous Matthew McConaughey voice, you become the bottleneck. And why should you do that when there is an alternative path for you besides using your own social security number, right?
Mhm.
Now, if you contrast this when you're building out using your EIN is all that you need for approval, right? That lender is going to be checking with the business credit reporting agency. So that's going to be done in Bradstreet. Experian Business, and Equifax Business. They're going to be looking at your Paydex score on the DMB side, and they're going to be looking at your IntelliScore. Plus, there are other scores that are there as well, that you have to be aware of. But for the most part, you've made that transition and rather than relying on you personally, your your credit obligation is going to be underwritten by the business, which is probably going to be some type of revenue based underwriting from there.
Mm.
So basically, here is if you, there's a second component to this, and I always stress that you would probably want to work with a community bank, a CDFI, or similar, a credit union, right? Because traditional banks such as Chase, Bank of America, they typically always will require a PG. You might even be able to go to a regional where they won't require a PG, but most regionals will require a PG as well, especially if it's an early stage business and it doesn't have a strong credit history, right?
Mhm.
So, a second bit of advice is avoid PGs, work with smaller institutions such as community banks and credit unions. Shout out to all of the in our local area, Apple Credit Union in Northwest Federal Credit Union, because I know plenty of people who have done business with those two entities, and they have always said positive things about working with those two entities. So let's close off this particular topic, Eunice. And this the big takeaway that we want you to have here is your if your personal credit, right, is being used for your business, right? Give me 1 second. If your personal credit is carrying your business, you don't own a business, you now own another liability, right?
Mm.
You are going to have to pay for that business should things not work out as you 100% desired. And I know of no business owner who has ever moved forward thinking that their business was not going to be successful. Similar to the copier
Yeah.
repairman, he I never tasted his food, but he told me that he was a great cook. Everybody in his neighborhood was always coming to him and asking him to make this dish, that dish, or another dish. But
Mhm.
the dynamics of the game change when you have overhead. The dynamics
Oh
of the
yeah.
game changes when you have uh payroll. The dynamics of the game change when you have rent and other expenses. And this is why we are here basically helping our community to be in a position where they're not making some of those same mistakes. And to also advise, we are also coming at this from a perspective of we have run into similar errors when we were creating our credit. And what we're now in a position to do is helping others to avoid the same mistakes that we have made, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you asked the question, there is a path to no PG funding, right? But that path requires structure. And the structure and the process is what we are introducing to our community. I actually was having a conversation on text with a young lady, and she told me she knew about business credit, but she started working on it nearly 2 years ago, right?
Mhm.
Literally, you can work your way through the tiers, I would say, in 3, 6, or 9 months. So when she told me she knew what business credit was, but it had been 2 years, I told her at this stage, if she had followed the proper structure and processes, she would have been at tier 4 at this point in time, and she would have had access to larger lines of credits and loans at the same time, right?
Mhm. But
So
what did she follow? What did was she following a
I,
specific program, or was she just
I think
trying
that
to
she was
figure it
just
out?
I think that she was relying on the internet, and she was
Right.
relying on other mediums that were advising her. At this point in time, I would have to assume that there are people who are using capabilities such as ChatGPT and others that would advise them on how to do this, right? But the major thing is you have to be working with vendors who are reporting, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You have to be working with vendors who are reporting, and that is something that is constantly, I believe, the one biggest hiccup that people run into is the fact that they are continuing to work with vendors and those vendors aren't reporting. Just recently, we got an email from Nav saying that the Nav card is going to be turned down. I believe it's going to be on March 1, that Nav is no longer going to be reporting from the Nav Prime card. So those trade lines are going to be disappearing. So if you're looking for those trade lines to be reporting from NAV, that's going to be something that you have to do differently as you move forward. So let's educate the community on the steps that they are going to have to do in order to get this right, right?
Uh-huh.
The first thing that they have to do is proper entity formation. So that's going to be an LLC or a corporation. Remember, first things first, you are never doing business in your personal name. Why take on that liability? The next thing that the lending sources, funding sources are looking for is a business phone number. Do not use at Gmail, at Hotmail, depending on your age, and even depending further on your age, and at AOL.com, right? You want to use a branded domain email, right? And it should be your name dot something, etc., at yourcompany.com, and also have address credibility, right? Do not use your home address. You want to use something, not a post office box, because there's a lot of crime that happens through post office boxes, but you can use something like a mailbox store. Or one of the things that works out really well is like a Regis or a Venture X is something that works out really, really well, right? And when you have the proper foundation in place, the next steps are going to be easier to build. The next step I would say is going to be your fundability setup. That's where we work with you to start you on that journey and on that process so that we know that you are doing this right and not accidental.
Uh-huh.
After the fundability setup, there's going to be creating your vendor accounts. Those are your net 30s, which are going to be setting up relationships with entities such as Uline and Granger, paying the net 30s, but it can be a net X, net 15, net 30, net 60. That's going to help you to build trade lines before you are seeking revolving credit, right? And that typically requires you to purchase something, pay it off, do that once, twice, thrice, and you're going to be on good standing. Having formed a relationships with your net 30s, you then graduate from your net 30s up to your store credit and also your cash credit, right? So I mentioned the names, right? You can work with institutions such as Uline and Granger are commonly used starter vendors in building business credit, and those are the strategies that we had used, right? We had to purchase some office supplies, right? We could have gone down to Staples, which is right here, or Office Depot. At the time, we didn't know that Office Depot used to report and no longer reported at a certain point in time. I think it was about 2024 where Uline, no, not Uline, Office Depot came off the list of vendors who were actually reporting, right? So as we close off that particular topic, I think the biggest takeaway that I want the audience to hear and hear us clear is that no PG funding isn't about tricks. It's all about strategy and positioning.